Post-COVID, Ecuador has had strong economic recovery and now finds itself in a much more secure fiscal position. At ASCOA, we've had a long relationship with the government of Ecuador. We've been to Quito and to Guayaquil for conferences in the past few years, and we will continue to support the country's economic growth through programs such as this one. We hosted President Lasso and First Lady Maria de Lourdes Alcivar at UNGA this year, alongside a high-level group of investors. It was our second time hosting President Lasso at 680, and we have also had a close relationship with the Ministry of Production, Foreign Trade, Investment, and Fisheries, and we've hosted Minister Prado virtually and in person. I would like to remind all of our guests that today's conference is public, on the record, and open to the press. And we will be recording the interview that Brian Winter does of Minister Prado, and you can find that on our website later. I would like to invite Minister Prado to give some welcoming remarks, and after his remarks, he will be interviewed by Brian Winter, and I won't come back up to ask you to come up, so you'll come up. So Minister Prado, the floor is now yours. Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Muy bien, ¿no? Good morning to all. Thank you so much for being here. Just very short opening remarks so that we can start with the event Open for Business in New York. Thank you so much for being here. A very warm and kind regard and salute to my fellow friends, Darío Herrera and Roberto Salas, for being here, and all the members from the different chambers from Ecuador and the business community from United States and other countries that are here. As I said, just some small opening regards. Ecuador is a country of opportunities, and today we are here to show that potential to businessmen and leaders from around the world, especially from business leaders from the United States. We are aware that in order to bring more Ecuador into the world and more world into Ecuador, we must open our doors to foreign investments and global markets. The first edition of Ecuador Open for Business, which is the event we're doing here today, was held in Ecuador in November last year, 2021, in which we have had more than 1,000 participants from 56 different countries. And one of the biggest delegations was, of course, business people from the United States. So that's why we're holding this new event here in New York. We have had last year more than 500 different meetings, and 279 business people, resulted in $5 billion attracted only last year and to this current date. To date, it fills me with great pride to inaugurate a new edition of Ecuador Open for Business New York, an investment attraction forum that has been replicated internationally, and we have executed in countries like Peru, Chile, Italy, Spain, and Israel, and now United States. This event represents a space that energizes the business ecosystem of our country and showcases an investment portfolio of more than $30 billion that we're going to show today. Ecuador Open for Business is a strategic line from our government, led by President Lasso, and that is linked to our current strategy, Ecuador Competes, which is the biggest competitive strategy we have created in the last years in Ecuador. Ecuador Competes has three different strategic lines, three different axes that we are promoting. First, having a more productive Ecuador, so lowering the costs of production, having a better business environment, reducing the costs of doing business in Ecuador. The second important line of Ecuador Competes is the global Ecuador, so more free trade agreements, more investment attraction and promotion, and that's what we're going to talk about in a minute as well. And the last and third line of Ecuador Competes is having a more competitive sector, so more innovation, more value added, and more entrepreneurship. We are a small but mega diverse country with an enormous potential for businesses open to the world and to opportunities. Therefore, we seek to position ourselves as an investment destination that allows us to integrate into the world economy. Our government is aware of this, and therefore we are committed to work with the private sector, considering that it is the best and probably the only ally to our economic development in Ecuador. We are consolidating an adequate business environment, optimizing socioeconomic conditions, and improving the legal security and framework to attract your investments and protect your investments in Ecuador, not only during this government, but in the medium and in the long term. We want to convey a message of confidence to our investments and to our investors. And from the government, we have been working towards creating a better economic framework, a macroeconomic framework, a more sound economic framework towards securing the investments in the short term and the long term. So, for example, one important figure that you will hear today is that we have managed to reduce the fiscal deficit very, very rapidly from $7 billion, roughly 7% of the GDP 2 years ago, to $2 billion at the end of this year. So this is an enormous task, and this is something that we are showcasing to everyone in the world. On the other hand, the international reserves have exceeded $8.4 billion, so that's roughly 8% of our GDP. And just to remember, these international reserves were $2 billion in March 2020. So we have gone from 2% international reserves to roughly 8% international reserves compared to the GDP. And this is really important to help to sustain the dollarization process in Ecuador. And a very important figure at this current moment in the world is that we have one of the lowest inflation rates, not only in Latin America, but probably around the world. The average inflation for the last 10 months in Ecuador is 3%. So compared to other countries, even here, United States, Europe, all over the world, this is a very important achievement that we have done in keeping up a very low inflation rate for the markets. So finally, let me say that we will continue to work with the firm purpose of opening the way to have a more ambitious investment policy attraction that promotes investments, that promotes businesses. And finally, I would like to reiterate that we will keep our doors open to the world and to opportunities, and this is what we're showcasing at the moment. Ecuador is open for business. Thank you so much.
Buenos dias, good morning. My name is Brian Winter. I'm the Vice President of Policy here at American Society and Council of the Americas. I'm also the Editor-in-Chief of America's Quarterly magazine. It's a pleasure, Minister Prado, to have you here this morning. Welcome. So I listened with interest to your opening presentation, and you said that Ecuador is open for business. It's a country that has a positive reputation right now amongst investors who look at Latin America as a whole. We are in a difficult external environment right now with U.S. interest rates going up. I think it's hard for countries all over the region to attract investment. What is the competitive advantage that Ecuador has compared to some other places in the world? Why Ecuador right now? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian, no? Brian, yeah. Thank you so much, Brian, for this interview and the opportunity. Hello again to everyone. Well, I think the competitive advantage of Ecuador at this moment, we can sum it up in different lines. So first of all, having a president like President Lasso that believes in private investments, that believes that opening up the economy is a good policy, that's something that is really important. We're not seeing many presidents in South America and Latin America that do have this vision. So right now in Latin America, Ecuador is a bright spot for investments because we have a business-friendly economy, so we have a business-friendly government. But of course, this is important in the short term for investors, but an investor wants to see a country that can develop these sort of policies in the long term and sustain these policies in the long term. So what are we trying to do in the short term? So first of all, We think that having more free trade agreements with more countries that we do have at the moment is something that is really going to be really important in the long term. So at the moment, for example, Ecuador has 10 free trade agreements that we have signed with different countries, especially countries in Latin America and with Europe, for example. But those 10 free trade agreements only represent 43% of our exports to the world. So most of our exports are not covered by free trade agreements. So we have to go into other markets and we have to pay really high tariffs. So what do we have to do? Well, we have to open up the economy, signing more FTAs with different countries in the world. So at the moment, our strategy is to sign, until the end of this government, 10 new free trade agreements with different countries all over the world. Latin America, with other countries in Europe, and of course with Asia. So that's what we're trying to do. And another competitive advantage that we have at this very same moment is a very sound macroeconomic policy and environment. Being a dollarized country, as I said before, give us a very strong currency, even if this currency is appreciating at the moment, which creates all sorts of problems for our export sector. In the long term, having a strong currency that does not devaluate and depreciate like other countries in Latin America would not create a strong inflation in the medium term. So that's something that is key for investments in Ecuador. And probably something that we can talk about and discuss later, Brian, is the problems that we have in Ecuador. Probably the least attractive part of investing in Ecuador is the political side. So we have different political problems in the National Assembly, but those are, and anyway, short-term problems that do not forecast a shadow in the long-term investment projects.
So I do want to talk about politics, but let's continue first with kind of Ecuador's place in the world. You mentioned the desire for free trade agreements, for signing 10.
10.
Wow,
yeah.
that's ambitious. I noticed that you mentioned other countries in Latin America, Europe, Asia, but there was one country missing, which was the United States.
Right.
And of course, we hear we have all kinds of trade ministers and foreign ministers from all over Latin America who come and speak to us here. And one very consistent theme is frustration with the U.S. administration, consecutive U.S. administrations now, for not being as open to new trade deals as they would hope. How would you describe Ecuador's trading relationship with the United States right now?
Okay, so first of all, the United States, in terms of our trade partner, the United States has been for a long-term trade partner. It's been the first partner until last year. And this year, sadly, the United States will be the second trade partner for us after China. And this is why we need an FTA right now with the United States. We need to have a trade agreement with this country because it's not only about being the first partner of our country, but it's the very large amount of different products that we send to this country. So compare, for example, to China, which is also, of course, our at the moment, it's our main export destination. The main product that we send to China are shrimps. So they are concentrated, more than 80%, 85% of our exports consist of shrimps to China, which is really important. But nevertheless, the amount of different export products that we can send to the United States and the great relationship we have in terms of migration relationships and also political relationships makes it one of the first countries whom we would like to have an FTA. Sadly, at the moment, the reality is that we have lost the train to have an FTA with the United States, a similar trade agreement like the one that was signed 15 years ago with Colombia and Peru. Nevertheless, we are here. After tomorrow, on Wednesday, we're going to Washington, and in Washington we have a trade agenda, a political agenda, in which we're going to talk with different trade representatives from the United States in order to move towards a second stage of our commercial agreement. So it's not a FTA agreement, but nevertheless we're moving towards completing the second stage of that agreement.
So you think there's room for progress even in the trading relationship with the United States, even without an FTA?
You know, if you would have asked this question before the pandemic, it would have been really difficult to move forward with the United States. At this moment, with how the value chains all over the world are reconfiguring and with the nearshoring in hand, I think there are great opportunities for Ecuador and to other countries in Latin America to rejoin, a possibility of an FTA.
Are there specific sectors where you think that nearshoring is particularly attractive for Ecuador?
Well, for example, I think the steel industry in Ecuador, the construction industry in Ecuador could be a great partner for the value chains in United States. Of course, I think that's the first one. The second important one could be the agricultural sector all over, and the food industry in our country, which of course is present here in the United States, but could be even bigger after the pandemic and take into account the nearshoring. And probably a third line that we haven't developed yet in Ecuador, but other countries like República Dominicana or Costa Rica have developed, in Uruguay for that matter, is the services sector. And with that service, I'm talking about software development and everything related to the service sector and, for example, the creation of plans for technology improvement. So changing those plans that used to be in Asia and relocating those in Latin America and specifically in Ecuador could be a great business for value chains in the United States.
Thank you. You mentioned China, and for people who watch Latin America as a whole, the Ecuador-China relationship has been one of specific interest over the years. And I noticed this recent debt renegotiation deal that happened, and you mentioned that they are now the #1 trading partner, having just passed the United States. How would you describe that relationship right now, and where do you think it's headed? What are the opportunities for Ecuador, and what are some of the risks?
Yeah, President Lasso is a very pragmatic president. So he knows that a small country like Ecuador cannot stay apart from any different investor on any market in the world. And that's why, we have consolidated the Chinese market as one of our trade partners, more important trade partners. This does not mean that we are forgetting other countries, other very important markets like United States. So we are focusing at the same time in Asia, in Europe, and of course in consolidating our trade relationship and political relationship with the United States. But there's something that is very real at the moment, Brian. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Brian. It's very real at the moment, is that China has become now, this year, the main trade partner for 120 countries all over the world. So China is there, whether we want to see it or not. So we want to send more products to China, yes, of course. We want to import more technology from that country. But at the same time, we're not going to forget other markets. In terms of the debt renegotiation, that's a really important macroeconomic milestone for our country. So in the past, sadly, there have been some intermediaries between the two governments, the Chinese government and the Ecuador government, that have gained a lot of money through oil exports and oil relationships with China. We have managed to secure a reduction of roughly $1.4 billion over the next 10 years of reduction in payments that we have to send, debt payments that we have to send to China. And especially we have managed to decouple the oil exports and the oil barrels that we have to send to China from that debt. So that's something that is really important. So that's the relationship we have.
I want to ask about Ecuador's relationship with the rest of Latin America as well. I talk about politics in a variety of forums, but I'm a specialist in Brazil. And as a result, with the election, which I'm sure you noticed, over the last 2 weeks, I have given 2 interviews to Ecuadorian radio. And in both interviews, I was asked about whether if Lula won, Ecuador would be isolated, to use their words, in a region where, especially if Lula wins in Brazil, where almost all of something like 85% of Latin America's population would be under left-leaning leaders, which of course that's not the case in Ecuador. Do people overstate the importance of that? How much do you think it matters? I mean, do you worry in some of these negotiations within the region for more trade and investment about Ecuador not being fully included because it's ideologically not as aligned as some of the others?
That's a tough question. Well, I think, yes, I can answer it in two ways. So first of all, President Lasso and our government have some of the best relationships with left-leaning governments in South America. I think it could be a concern. It could be a concern if those political leaders start to close up the economy, and we might see in the near future some crisis, political crisis in some countries, and some social disruption in some of these countries. And this could create a problem for everyone in Latin America. So Ecuador is a small country, and foreign investors and banking investors from time to time tend to see Latin America as one whole subcontinent, right? So this could create, if other countries fail to deliver in the short term, this could create a problem also for Ecuador in terms of the view from international investors. But nevertheless, I think in the short term, and especially after the pandemic, we're going to see that those left-leaning leaders are also going to be pragmatical. This is what I hope, and that we're going to keep, the best relationship with every single leader in Latin America. So it's not something that we're very worried about. On the other hand, I do think that this represents a great opportunity for Ecuador, because we have had some left-leaning governments in the past, socialist countries, socialist leaders in the past, and we have been a closed economy. So now that we have a government that wants to attract foreign investments, that want to do the right businesses, that wants to get rid of corruption and everything, and work with the private sector, I think that now in Latin America, the few countries that are following, this path are probably Uruguay and then Ecuador in South America. So that's an opportunity.
I was going to ask about Uruguay. I mean, Uruguay has positioned itself somewhat in recent years as kind of an island of stability on the Atlantic coast in a region that has had some volatility these last couple of years. Is there a possibility that Ecuador could be kind of the Pacific coast equivalent, or is that saying too much?
No, absolutely. On February, we tried to pass a bill, a new law, a new investment law in Ecuador. And that investment law was using the benchmark from Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, and Uruguay, in order to attract international investment for services, especially. Sadly, that law didn't pass in the National Assembly, but at the moment, there's the political willingness in the National Assembly and in the government to pass a new law. So that's going to be a free trade zone law that is going to contain parts of this initial bill of February, and it's going to be focused on attracting investments to free trade zones. And that's very similar to what Costa Rica and Uruguay did in the last 30 years, or Uruguay in the last 5 years. So I do think that we can manage to increase the level of FDI that comes to our country. At the moment, if you see the last probably 15 years of FDI, foreign direct investments, compared to GDP in Ecuador, the average has been around 0.8%, so not even 1%. So compared to other countries in Latin America, Ecuador is the country that is attracting less FDI compared to countries that are even smaller, Costa Rica, Uruguay, and other countries. So we have to step it up. So that's the idea. Yeah, we could be even better than Uruguay and Costa Rica in the near future.
I started my career 22 years ago as a financial reporter. I was working for Reuters based in Buenos Aires. And it's been fascinating to me to watch how countries change over time, often for the better. And I remember that year when I first started, it was a year of tremendous instability in Ecuador. And it seemed like back then, Ecuador was kind of a synonym for political instability within the region. That has changed. Not just with this administration, but really in recent years. I mean, it's become much more stable. I know that we have lots of Ecuador specialists here in the room, but for those who maybe don't follow the country quite as closely on a day-to-day basis, can you tell us a little bit like the longer-term story of how Ecuador arrived at least a certain imperfect, but a certain equilibrium politically today, and why it's more stable than it used to be?
Yeah, another tough question, because I'm not a specialist in that side of the politics. But nevertheless, let me try to answer that question. I think after dollarization in the year 2000, Ecuador has managed to put in order its economy. So that, of course, having a stable economy always helps, to avoid the social turmoil that we used to have. Then, on the other hand, we had a president that stayed in power for 10 years. So that's stability, of course. But that's the sort of stability that you don't want to have in an economy like Ecuador. A president or presidents that wants to stay forever and that wants to, pass to actually stay there for a long term and make a more presidential kind of presidentialism country is something that we're not, we don't want to see in the near future. I think that democracy in our countries, especially in Ecuador, needs to change. The president from time to time, 4 years or at the most 8 years, and that's the most stable in terms of the political time that we need to have. So that's an important part of what we have seen in Ecuador. Probably the macroeconomic stability, that's one point. And on the other hand, we have seen that, as you said, Brian, at the beginning, Ecuador used to be seen outside as a very, very unstable social country. But at the moment, there are many other countries in Latin America that have experienced the same type of, social unrest that we have seen in Ecuador, and even worse. For example, we have never imagined that in Chile would have had such a strong social unrest. Colombia, Peru, and other countries in Latin America. So we're not alone, and this is how Latin America behaves. The important thing, Brian, is that in the near future, that social unrest, that social inequalities are controlled and held in a way that allows us to have a more stable economy in the near future. I don't know if this makes sense.
It makes total sense. And let me ask you one or two questions, and then I'll open things up to the audience. Maybe you'll get easier questions from them. How you mentioned in your opening remarks the possibility of basically what you were just referencing. I mean, it is a country that has had some social unrest, that has an opposition with a different vision of things. How much commitment do you think there is, though, to the basic principles of a long-term vision for Ecuador? Are there big differences between those sides, or do you think there's some consensus around basic points?
Consensus on the long term?
On the macroeconomic side,
on the
especially.
macroeconomics? Okay, I think there's almost probably 98%, 99% consensus of keeping the dollar as our main currency. So dollarization has to stay in Ecuador. It's a very popular mechanism. And I think if we were in a dollarized economy at this moment and after the pandemic, it would have been an economic mess, our country. So that's something that we need to keep up in the near future. On the other hand, probably there's also an important consensus of opening up the market. I mean, even if there are some people and some sectors that consider that having more free trade agreements is not always good for the economy, in general, the consensus is that Ecuador needs to have more trade agreements with many other countries in the world and reducing the costs of doing business with those countries. And we do think that people in general think that's something that we need to be done in the near future. On the other hand, there's not much of a consensus of what are the best policies, in terms of keeping the growth in the long term. I think that's going to be something that is going to be discussed in the next 10 years, 20 years in Ecuador. Do we have to follow a more liberal, economical policy, or do we have to lean towards a more social policy? For me, in my case, I think being the Minister of Production, I think that's a sterile kind of debate. I think we need to follow up a more open market policy, more free trade agreements, more investments, and at the same time have a very high social investment in Ecuador because there's a great inequality, there's a lot of poverty, especially after the pandemic. So if we're going to grow and we're going to attract businesses, it's really important that this growth, this investment shows somehow in the social figures, less employment, less inequality, more public investments, more schools, more roads, you know, everything there. Because otherwise, this model that we're trying to create in the macroeconomic and microeconomic environment, if it doesn't show in the social indicators and social numbers, then this model cannot be, replicated in the near future. So I think that's something really important.
And then specifically, can you talk a little bit about some of the opportunities in the mining sector?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. Well, my colleagues, especially Roberto Salas, is going to talk with more detail about this. But let me tell you something. Right now, this year, 2022, the mining exports are going to represent the third largest export sector in Ecuador. And probably 3 years ago, they didn't represent even 0%. So now, by the end of this year, we will have more than $2 billion in exports products, mining products from the mining sector. So it's going to represent the third largest export sector. So first oil, then the shrimps, which are growing really, really rapidly. After shrimps, mining, and then tuna and bananas, no? Competing in the fourth or fifth place. So the mining sector we want to develop is an environmental and sustainable mining sector in Ecuador. We think that there's a tremendous opportunity for this sector. Investors from all over the world, especially from the United States and European investors in the mining sector. We already have great mining companies from this country investing in Ecuador. And I believe that being a country that arrives late to the mining industry after Peru, after Chile, we can do things even better than they did, especially in the social part and in the environmental part. So that's why we're keeping track everything to have a sustainable mining in Ecuador. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, now let's take a couple questions from the audience. If you have one, please raise your hand and we'll bring you the microphone. And if you could then identify yourself and make sure your question is in the form of a question. It's a shy group this morning. Surely somebody has a question. Please, Randy.
We talk a lot about investing with social responsibility, and you just went into some aspects of social investment in Ecuador. Could you highlight what projects, plans you have that you think would move the proverbial needle on this?
Yes. Again, I'm not an expert in the social part of the social political agenda, but nevertheless, that's something that for President Lasso is really important. As we grow the economy, as the GDP grows, as the investment grows, it's really important to develop the human capital that is needed to attract those investments in the long term. So first of all, one of the most important things is that we need to look at our, how do we call campesinos, the indigenous people?
Peasants.
Our peasants.
Farmers is
our
better.
farmers, yeah. To our farmers, especially in the Sierra, Central Sierra of Ecuador. That's something really important because the level of unemployment, the level of undernourished child is amazing. I mean, it's horrible. So one of the key policies that President Lasso has presented from day one of government is that the investment and the reduction of malnutrition in Ecuador. So more than $500 million have been put together just for that project, which is a presidential project. And President Lasso has announced from day one that he will sell for example, one important asset that we have, a financial asset, Banco del Pacífico, which is the second largest bank in Ecuador. Once he sells that Banco del Pacífico, all the assets from that sale will go to this malnutrition project that President Lasso is leading up in the country. So that's something that in the future needs to continue, and so that's something really important. On the other hand, I think that changing the matrix of investments in Ecuador, so allowing the private sector to do things that they do better, and the public sector retiring from those investments that could be done by private investors, would leave more money in the table to invest in education, in poverty alleviation, and health. And these are key issues that need to be tackled by the public sector. So changing this matrix, and let me tell you a figure about this. In the last former government, the investment in Ecuador was done 80% of the foreign direct investment, of the local investments were done by the government. 80% were public investments, and 20% were foreign direct investments or private investments from local people. So now we're changing that. And at the moment, roughly 25% of the total investments are done by the government, and 70% is done by private investments, either local or foreign direct investments. And that's more sustainable in the near future because it doesn't depend, on the oil reserves or the capacity of the government to invest in the economy. So that leaves more space to invest in education, in health, and in poverty, and that's what we're doing at the moment. So that's the vision.
Gracias, Ministro, por tomarse el tiempo de estar con nosotros. As an Ecuadorian, it's very fantastic to see that Ecuador is opening itself to the world after being a protectionist country for so long. My question to you would be about the discussions with Mexico about the commercial agreement. If you could give us a take on where they're headed, given this is a very essential week for it.
Great. That's not a tough question. That one I know. So Mexico, yeah. When we took the office almost 18 months ago, there were already negotiations with Mexico towards having this free trade agreement. They were roughly at 45% of development last year, and now we have gone to 99%. So it's almost over. So I used to say that we only need to finish 1% of our negotiation, and that's roughly we're one shrimp away of finishing, because the big problem in that 1% represents shrimps and bananas, mainly. Last week, I was in Mexico, actually. I went there to a ministerial meeting with the Pacific Alliance members. This Pacific Alliance is a group held by Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico. And we want to be part of that group. The Pacific Alliance is really important. So we have to finish our bilateral trade agreement with Mexico in order to join the Pacific Alliance. And I'm very hopeful and I'm very positive that by the end of November, we will have great news with Mexico. And I will tell you why. By the end of November, last week of November, we will have the biggest presidential conference from Alianza del Pacífico countries that will be held in Mexico, and President Lasso is invited. And the only way in which we're going to go to that conference if we have finished the free trade agreement. And we have announced that we are going, so we have 1 month to finish the negotiations. And as I said, the main barrier that we have at the moment is our shrimps. And I just gave to the new Secretary of Economy and to the new team that is negotiating in Mexico the last proposal from Ecuador. So hopefully we will get a good review in 2 weeks, and let's see how it works. Yeah? So that's the idea. Finish with Mexico by the end of November. If that doesn't happen, then we will have to rethink our strategy towards that free trade agreement. At the same time, we are not stopping with other free trade agreements. At the same moment, we are negotiating 4 free trade agreements. First, Mexico, as I said. The second one is Costa Rica. Costa Rica is going to be finished by the end of this year. So in December, we're going to finish the technical negotiation. South Korea. South Korea is going to be finished by the first trimester of next year. Roughly, we have an advance of 60%. And China. China is going to be finished by the end of this year, December as well. Yeah.
Thank you. We had a question here. Please identify yourself if you don't mind.
Sure. Mucho gusto, Ministro. Gracias por estar aquí. My name is Pedro José Izquierdo from Sullivan and Cromwell here in New York City. I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to ask you a question about law. Specifically, in the context of these free trade agreements that you are discussing, how is Ecuador approaching its dispute resolution mechanisms with investors? The Correa administration was famous for denouncing many of these treaties because they contained arbitration clauses that allowed foreign investors to initiate arbitration claims against the state. It seems that President Lasso wants to allow investors to have that opportunity again as a way of attracting that investment. He rejoined the ICSID convention which regulates investor-state arbitrations at the beginning of his administration, and I just wanted to hear what you think about, or what the government thinks about those in the context of these negotiations of these new agreements. Thank you.
Sí. Yes, Pedro. So first of all, at the beginning of the government last year, we rejoined el CIADI in Spanish, ISIAD, I think from the World Bank. So that was a very important sign of when we want to take, the investment protection agreements in this government. So rejoining CIADI was really important for our international, politics in Ecuador. The second thing that will show you where we want to go with our protection agreements is that we are at the moment renegotiating all the bilateral investment protection agreements that were denounced by President Correa in 2016. No? The first agreement that we're going to sign in next months is going to el TBI, bilateral protection agreement with Spain. At this same moment, we are negotiating that one. After that, we're going to move to, with TBA with Uruguay, and then probably a couple of other countries, one country in Europe and another country in Asia. I'm not going to say which countries because it's still to be decided, but that's what we want to do. So first of all, CIADI, second, bilateral protection agreements, and the third part of our policy towards attracting investment and protecting those investments in the future is the new law. So hopefully we will be able to pass this new investment law in the National Assembly soon. So that's the first part, the third part that we're trying to do. And Roberto Salas is going to talk about later about what his secretary is doing in order to to fulfill those commitments in the future and to create I would say the institutions and the reforms that need to be there in order to attract investments in the long term. No?
Who else? Yes, up here at the front, please. If you could just pass the microphone down.
Hello. Good morning, Arturo Vanegas from Ackerman. Also a lawyer, but not with a legal question. I've heard some references to your oil industry and how important it is for Ecuador, but I didn't hear about any plans, any steps that you're taking in order to increase the oil production. and also considering that the United States is now seeking more oil to bring into the U.S., isn't this a good option for Ecuador to reinforce the relationship with the U.S.?
Absolutely. I think in terms of the public-private partnerships and the concessions part of the investments, you will hear about Roberto in a moment. But there are three sectors that are really important in terms of to attract those investments. So first of all, mining, that's really important for our country. Second, energy, especially renewable energy. That's a sector that is booming in Ecuador in different areas, and we're seeing important firms from all over the world investing in solar, wind energy, hopefully other type of renewable energy in the near future. And oil, of course. I haven't talked about oil because it's a no-brainer. Ecuador needs to expand its oil production. It needs to expand its oil investment. And we're not going to do that using public money. We're going to do that using foreign direct investments or local investments that want to expand the oil production. And that's something that President Lasso has been committed to as well. And that's a very difficult target, to double up the amount of production of oil in the next 4 to 5 years. So there we need more, of course, international investors going to our economy. And we realized that in the past we haven't done the best to keep those investors happy in the oil sector, but that's something that we need to regain in the near future, let's say, to open up the economy in that sector. And of course, I think if we manage to move forward, not with a free trade agreement, but re-enhancing the relationship with the United States, those investments in mining, in energy, and in oil could, be part of the political discussions in the near future, probably, yeah. But you will hear more from Roberto in that side.
Well, let me ask another question now.
Sure.
As investment is part of your portfolio along with trade, and sometimes what investors are looking for is kind of a long-term horizon, like a 10-year horizon, if not longer. When you think about Ecuador 10 years from now, what would you like to see? I mean, what's your vision for Ecuador, say, in 2032, and how is it different from the way the country looks today?
Okay, great. Yes, I think, and I will put myself in the shoes of an investor, an investor that wants to do businesses, either local investor or foreign investor in a country like Ecuador. So one thing that I think is really important for doing business in a country like Ecuador in 10 years is that, of course, we can say whatever we want being in a government, and I can give you all type of figures, and hopefully you will believe in those because they're true. But always the thing with countries like Ecuador in Latin America is that what's going to happen after this government. So how are we going to keep up, the same speed of reforms and opening up the economy and free trade agreements and everything? So first of all, these are the locks that we have to introduce in the economy. So those locks are really important. So the first lock is more trade agreements. Why? Because once you have a free trade agreement, that becomes international law. So you have higher benchmarks. The second thing is investment protection agreements. So it's very difficult if you don't have those type of international benchmarks to attract investments in the long term in a country. And the third thing that is really important is to have a national competitiveness strategy in the long term. And why is this so important? And of course, I'm the Minister of Production, so this is really important for me, is that when local firms or international firms want to move into a country, they don't want to be the only player in the neighborhood. They want to be part of a thriving business ecosystem that consists of larger clusters, more competitive enterprises, to have more collaboration and competition among firms in a specific industry. That's really important. So a mining company, for example, they don't want to be the only one investing in one region in Ecuador. They want to be a part of a larger mining ecosystem in which the country and the public commits, to do the investments that they have to do, and you have more firms to talk about. So this is what I would like to see in Ecuador in 10 years. So more collaboration, more multinational firms collaborating with local firms, and finally having roughly around 80% of our exports covered by free trade agreements. That's hopefully what we will manage to do, not in 10 years, hopefully in 4 to 5 years. So that's really important. And so something similar to what has happened in other countries in Latin America, more multilateral firms, more investors in Ecuador having a relationship with those firms. So that for me would be the ideal ecosystem. So a more dynamic ecosystem in Ecuador.
We have about 2 minutes left, and so I wanted to offer you the opportunity to make any final concluding remarks.
Okay. So I think the most important part here is that hopefully I was able to show you the willingness from the government of Ecuador to bring you to Ecuador, to showing you that we have the willingness to change whatever we need to change in the short term, to attract your investments to our country. Our task is not easy, of course. It is not easy to change everything we want to change in Ecuador. It's going to take not only this administration from President Lasso, but probably the 2 next administrations to make the changes that we need to do in order to attract and to change the path of FDI in the long term. But if we manage to do what we have to do in the short term and bringing you to Ecuador, that's what is going to change our country in the near future. We are completely sure that it's not the government task to change Ecuador, but it's the private sector that actually changes the economies in the long term. So your investments are really important in order to keep the social unrest short, small, in Ecuador. That's really important. So from time to time, we get to ask, what do we have to do, or what's going to happen with the indigenous, social unrest and with the social issues in Ecuador? And the short question is that we don't really know, but the only way to avoid a new social unrest in Ecuador, like the one we had in June, is to invest more, to do our job in the government, to invest in social security, to invest in roads, to invest in the public, procurement, to invest in everything we can do. But at the end of the day, we do believe that in the long term, the only way to grow an economy, to have a more prosperous country, is to have more private investors, foreign and local investors. So that's the message. Yeah.
Minister Prado, I want to thank you for being here, for your words. Maybe a few of the questions were a little bit challenging, reflecting the challenging situation I think all of our countries face right now. But your answers I found so direct and so honest, and that's a breath of fresh air. So thank you so much for being here. A round of applause, please, for Minister Prado.